Let's dive straight into it. Here are the 3 ways to make your films more cinematic. First up is camera movement. Now, I'm actually not a big fan of tripods, even though I know there are some scenes are necessary to be static. For example, when there's a serious conversation between two people having a dialogue, or when there is something you want the audience to focus on.
Your name.
Is uh your
What I've also realized is that when you're a beginner filmmaker, you always tend to have very static shots in your films. I don't know why, maybe it's what you can afford and what's easier to do. And that's when often people ask me, how do I make my films more cinematic? Usually, most of the time, I like to use a camera slider, which helps to draw your attention from point A to point B. For example, in my short film My Dead Husband, in this scene where two people are having a dialogue, you could set the camera just pointing static at each character while they talk, but by using a slider to move from the first character to the second character creates that mystery, also that sense of cinematic movement.
I like to visualize the person I'm talking to.
of course East Asian, average build.
Another good example of using the slider is in my short film Psychosis, where the main character wakes up from the floor and he sits up. To achieve this shot, the initial few seconds were digitally zoomed in and then rotating the video clip. And then after that, that's where the slider takes over, slides up from the ramp to his sitting position.
Hello, Mark.
Of course, if you want more flexibility, you should use a gimbal. And recently, I've changed my whole setup based around the gimbal, where the lens are able to do autofocus through the LiDAR system so that I can use the gimbal anywhere, be versatile with it, running, chasing. One obvious gimbal movement that I really like is tracking the character, whether they're moving through space, behind them, in front of them, or even going around them. It just gives you that more immersive feel, taking the audience on a journey with that character. But don't forget that just like anything in filmmaking, any camera movement has to serve the story. Don't just have a camera movement as a gimmick or something that looks cool. Next up is slow motion. When you think of epic, larger than life, or even some of the most emotionally powerful scenes in cinema, chances are a good number of them have utilized slow motion. Why? Because it's an extraordinary tool for enhancing the emotional intensity and visual aesthetics of a scene. It can turn an ordinary moment into something extraordinary, and that's what cinematic filmmaking is all about. Majority of slow motion are used during action scenes. For example, in this short film I made called Night Rulers, I wanted to show the running of this vampire character at slower speed because normally vampires run really fast. But also I used the slow motion scene on this character to show his reaction from the biting. Believe it or not, these shots actually were shot at 50 frames per second, and then it was digitally slowed down even more on the editing software. The reason is that when you shoot a high frame rate, you have to increase the shutter speed, which requires more light. And on top of that, normally the sensor is cropped, so you get a lower resolution. So my advice is that if you want to keep the higher resolution but still want that super slow motion effect, then shoot it as high as you can at normally 60 or 50 frames per second. And in post, I use DaVinci Resolve, change the return process to optical flow, and then also the motion estimation to speed warp. So your footage will look slow than it was shot without compromising the resolution. Now on to the final part, probably the most important, lighting. First and foremost, let's talk about the essential role of lighting in setting the mood of a scene. A well-lit scene can evoke feelings and emotions in the viewer before a single line of dialogue is spoken. Dark, shadowy lighting can create a sense of mystery or foreboding, while bright, soft lighting can evoke feelings of joy and serenity. Mastering this element allows us to tap into the emotional core of our audience, enhancing the cinematic quality of our film. Now, I know what you're thinking, big and good lighting are expensive. And you are quite right, but there are other cheaper methods to get that cinematic lighting. For example, in this night scene where the character is walking on a street, we didn't have the budget to set up big massive lights around her, so we just used the tube light and the results still look really cinematic. One good tip to get cinematic lighting is to use a smoke machine whenever you can. This technique, known as volumetric lighting, can add a remarkable layer of depth and atmosphere to your scenes. Another way is to use the practical lights you can find in locations as much as you can. For example, in my short film Who's There, in this scene we only used a couple of tube lights in the doorway and the rest were practical lights around the house. But it was still able to create this mysterious and moody scene from the film. Which brings me to the final tip of this video. As long as you're creative, anything is possible.
What's the matter? Get you some water. Stay here. Hold tight, Mark. I'm coming.
Ask who's there.
Mark? Mark, quit fooling around. Mark! Mark!